And we're back on Shardlight Radio. I'm your host, Mr. Ben, and on today's episode, we're having a fight. This is a argument that came up on my friend group Discord server, and then when I saw somebody fishing for topics to discuss on Raven's Discord server, I threw it out there. It was grounds for fertile conversation in both places. So on today's episode, what I am going to do is compare and contrast the two water one-drops, Mr. Kin's Cryptic Familiar and the Azure Seer. I am aware that tomorrow, September 12th, there will be a third water one-drop, but let's be real. Amateur Witch? No. To begin, I want to tackle the most meaningless aspect of the card art. Mr. Kin's is a cat apparently owned by the ugliest dude in the entire game. I don't know what is happening with this guy's face, but he absolutely looks like he is suffering from leprosy while this heartless cat just kind of gazes on at his plight. As far as card art goes, I didn't actually understand that the cat was Mr. Kin's when I first looked at this card. I mean, obviously it has the beast tag as a unit. That tag is not currently relevant for anything, but at some point there will probably be stuff that you get synergy and bonuses for having beasts, and at that point maybe that will be relevant. Currently it is not, but I totally thought that Mr. Kin's was just this like really ugly guy, which made the flavor text on the card even funnier because it says eyes laced with Shardlight, and I'm looking at this dude and his eyes look dingy and hollowed out. Did not immediately know it was the cat. The Azure Seer's card art is a little more dynamic. The Seer herself is not hideously ugly, and flavor text on this card is water has no beginning or end. It, like time, simply flows. So aesthetically, I definitely prefer the Azure Seer to Mr. Kin's. Okay, none of that matters. Let's get to the actual card evaluation. Both of these cards are one drops, so they can each come out on turn one. Each card has an arrive effect, which we will need to discuss at some length, and each card has a power value, like all units do. The unit tag on Azure Seer is just unit, so even if at some point there is a unit tribe called Witch or Wizard or Magic User or something, she's not going to benefit from that without some kind of an errata. The exhaust effect on Mr. Kin's is the thing I want to tackle first. There is no exhaust effect on the Azure Seer, so it would seem that just by virtue of having this ability, it edges out Mr. Kin's as being the better card. Hey, this card can do one thing, this card can do two things. But let's look at this ability. Exhaust, draw one card, then return this card to the top of its owner's deck. If that ability was return this card to its owner's hand, I would hands down say Mr. Kin's is the better card. But because you get a draw and the price you have to pay for that is losing presence on the board and spoiling your next turn's draw. That is awful. That's a really big deal. That's really bad. Now, it's true that there are a number of effects, such as the Azure Seer, where you could take a Mr. Kin's off the top of your deck. You play him, you get his arrive effect, you exhaust him, draw an extra card, send him to the top, and then bottom him so that going into turn 3 or 4 or whatever, you don't draw this fairly mediocre power one drop. I think that world doesn't really exist. I think in the vast majority of use cases, Mr. Kin's is here for his arrive ability, and you're never going to use this exhaust. Yes, there are times when drawing an extra card absolutely means the difference between winning and losing a game. However, I think in the majority of cases, Mr. Kin's is going to die to combat or some kind of effect, and he is not going to end up being put on the top of his owner's deck. I don't like that ability. I think getting one extra card at the price of going tempo negative on the board and ruining your next draw is just bad. So I'm going to set aside that whole exhaust ability on Mr. Kin's. I don't think that power is at all relevant to comparing these two cards. We're going to start to talk about arrive abilities. The Azure Seer's arrive ability allows you to look at the top card of your deck and put it back on the top or bottom of your deck. Magic players would call this scry. I refer to this as agenting due to my Versus background. That is, I think, the key difference between this card and Mr. Kin's. Being able to put a card on the bottom of the deck to see something that you don't want to draw next turn. And because the Seer herself is only 1 mana, you can put her into play on turn 5 and go, whoa, that's a really bad draw going into turn 6, and get rid of it. Mr. Kin's arrivability, on the other hand, allows you to look at 2 cards. Now, it is true that going deeper into your deck and seeing 2 cards instead of 1 card is better. 2 is more than 1. However, you don't get to send anything to the bottom. All you can do is reorder the cards. So you can choose the stack, but you can't choose to get rid of it. And I think that's a huge difference. The question here is looking at 2 cards better than being able to get rid of 1 card if it's bad? And I think in most cases, the answer to that question is no. I would rather look at 1 card and have the option of sending it to the bottom of the deck because it's not situationally appropriate than looking at 2 cards and going, oh crap, neither of these are good. I'll put the least bad one on top. I just think there's going to be more often times where getting rid of that bad draw is going to feel good, it's going to be important, and it's going to be impactful to how the game goes forward. Then there are times where taking a card you don't want to draw and putting it 1 card down. Now, the reverse is also true. There are going to be times where looking at 2 cards and the second card down is the card that you want to draw, so you can put it on top. Well, that happens with the Azure Seer anyway, sort of, except that card that you don't want, instead of being now the top card on your deck after your next draw, it's on the bottom. You don't have to worry about it. According to this metric, as far as who has the better arrivability, I have to lean to the Seer. Referring to card power, Mr. Kin's is 500 and the Seer is 1000. Now, this is the point in the show where I want to bring up the Amateur Witch. This is a 1-cost water-affiliated character with a blank text box. And the flavor text, well, that didn't go as expected. Feels about right for this cycle of blank texted cards. The reason I bring up the Amateur Witch is because it is a 1-cost with 1000 power that does nothing. If you use this as the baseline to look at a water 1-drop, you have the Azure Seer, which checks the same boxes that the Witch does, plus it has this extremely good power. You have Mr. Kin's, which is weaker than the blank texted Witch for the same cost, and has a power that I'm not sure that that's actually better than the Seer. Now, Kin's does have the exhaust ability, but again, I think the exhaust ability is largely bad, so I don't know that you can count that as a plus that makes up for this loss in power. So let's talk about the loss in power. 500 versus 1000. There are towers in the game that you can crack with 1000 power. There are no towers that you can crack with 500 at this point in the game's life. Being able to, on turn 2, attack and scout a tower, so no matter what my plays are, I can send in Kin's and I can turn a tower face up and then I know what I'm dealing with, is valuable. It advances the game state in a way that is advantageous to you to be able to have those quote-unquote safe attacks where Mr. Kin's flips a card up and it's just pure knowledge for you and there's no risk of there being some kind of a downside. So the real point of comparison between these 2 cards comes down to the value of information versus the value of aggression. Are the situations in which you're punished for attacking blindly into a tower on turn 2 and, oh, it was a fire tower, oh, that's terrible to crack that now, you can kill my 2-drop or whatever. Are those kinds of scenarios going to happen often enough that it's better to be able to attack for 500 and safely scout while you're building your board? Is it better to get that early game advantage, or is it better to take things a little bit slower and make sure that you don't crack a tower at the wrong time where it really hurts you? Obviously, there are going to be game states where both of those scenarios are true. There's some percent of the time where getting a tower cracked on turn 2, even if it's the fire tower that kills your 2-drop because you recruited and then declared attacks in the wrong order, those situations are going to happen. I think the percent of the time where you're in a better place by getting that early tower cracked, even running the risk of the times where that backfires on you, I think that's going to happen way more often than the times where, oh man, I really wish I would have attacked into that tower and gotten the information. Advancing, the Azure Seer presents the ability to advance yourself closer to winning the game, whereas Kin's just gives you some information. Yes, that information does advance you closer to winning the game, but I don't think the amount of times where Kin's being 500 wins you the game versus the Seer being 1000, I don't think that's going to happen very often. Very small edge case percent of the time is that going to happen, which means I think the Azure Seer has better artwork, a better arrivability, and a better stat line. The only area in which Kins has the edge is that it has an arrivability plus another power, which isn't a very good power. So for me, and that's the opinion that matters because this is my show, I guess, for me, I want to say that if I have to choose one, I'm going to choose the Azure Seer. Now, in a lot of decks, I want to run both of these guys as my 1-drops. I like both of these cards a tremendous amount. But I think if I have to pick the one that's the best, I'm throwing in with the Azure Seer. Go win some games.